Okay, so as Susan said, the title of my talk is The Future for Our Nature Reserves at the North Wales Wildlife Trust. So obviously that's quite a topic. We've 35 and a half nature reserves, not going to be able to cover all of them, and also some of the issues, it's going to be difficult to go into a lot of detail, but hopefully I'll give us a taste of some of the issues that we're facing and some of the solutions as well, and how we're trying to work towards making our nature reserves more resilient in face of some of the changes. Yeah, and hopefully we'll have a bit of a chance for a few questions and maybe a little bit of a discussion at the end. Okay, so just quickly, so this is my usual slide that sort of summarizes the trust. But just to highlight a few things for people. Firstly, the number of staff now, the trust has grown tremendously, particularly in the last 10 years or so. As Susan mentioned, we've got like a whole team of invasive species people, and Thomas is just one of them. But also our membership is doing really well. We're one of the best trusts in the whole of the UK for our membership growth, but also our membership retention. And we have a really strong volunteer team, over 800 volunteers, and that includes our trustees as well, of which at the moment we've got 11. Okay, so I'm going to be focusing on our nature reserve. So our 35 and a half nature reserves are spread all across North Wales. And I'm going to be jumping backwards and forwards across North Wales, looking at different examples and different sites to highlight some of the various issues. But I think just to start somewhere, one of the things we have to consider is that before we even think about climate change, and maybe partly due to climate change, but nature, wildlife in the UK and in Wales is not in a very good state. I was just looking at something earlier on today saying that Wales is one of the most nature depleted countries in the whole of Europe. So we're not in a very good position at the moment, and something desperately needs to change. So things like the State of Nature report, which came out last year, highlighting some of the problems we're facing throughout the country, with the levels of decreasing, with most species sort of showing a decline in their abundance. Relatively few increasing, and there tend to be very particular species which are favouring some of the changes in conditions that we're getting. So generally speaking, not in a good place. And then if you put on top of that the changes in climate, and I'm sure you're all familiar with this sort of bar chart type graph, is showing you how much the temperature has changed compared to sort of a global average over the last sort of 140 years or so. Yeah, it's obvious that there are significant changes occurring, and there's a vast amount of information out there about the nature of those changes. I'm not going to be sort of talking about those sort of in a general way, but I will be looking at some of this very specific impact. And I've borrowed this nice little graphic from the Somerset Wildlife Trust, which I thought was really helpful. Just lists some of the key impacts that we could see in relation to climate change. So you've got sea level rise and coastal flooding, river flooding, surface water flooding, wildfire, fire, and heat and drought. I'll come back to each of these, other than wildfire, which really, as far as our nature reserves are concerned, we haven't seen a significant issue in the last sort of 10 years or so. But that doesn't mean we won't see one in the future. So look out for these little symbols, which will reappear in the corners of various slides as we go along to highlight the sort of the nature of the impact. Just to start somewhere, we're about as far away as I can get from Bangor. This is Old Pulford Brook Meadow, which is right on the Wales-England border. It used to be known as Three-Cornered Meadow, basically because the three corners of it were right on the border. And it's a really cracking example of a floodplain meadow, if not the best in Wales. A range of species sort of indicative of that sort of habitat, sort of wide range of species, things like greater burnet and meadow sweet, but also some more unusual species like the tiny little mouse tail, which actually likes very, very open habitat that you sort of get around gates as a result of stock grazing. And you can see here that there's hardly any sort of grass thatch on the bottom of that picture. So very, very open, disturbed by the cattle walking in backwards and forwards. So just going back to that slide, this is what it looks like when it's at its best, towards the end of the summer. during winter, as the name suggests, it does flood, and this is what it can look like. What we've been seeing in recent years is the level of flooding has increased. It stays on the site, so the flooding comes from the D, and it stays on site for significantly longer than previous years, and it also starts to occur much earlier than it used to, with the D sort of in full flood, making it impossible to cut hay either at the time or after, because by the time it's flooded like this, sort of, and this has happened in August when we would be thinking about hay, all the grass is completely flattened and impossible to cut. So that's a really significant issue, and is leading to a change in the habitat. We're seeing a lot more domination by rush, and we're sort of looking at various ways that we might be able to deal with that in the future. But sometimes it's not all bad news about the way the climate has changed, and particularly with rainfall. So looking at marsh gentian, which is one of the key species that cause goch. So you can see the little blue flowers are down here, with some keen counters in the background there. It seems to be doing quite well at the moment. The graph on the left-hand side of the screen shows how the numbers have increased in the last few years in particular. So the records go back to the 1970s. And what we can see here is generally sort of an increase in numbers. It's slightly exaggerated because of the condensed nature of the scale. But one of the important things to think about or to consider here is that as far as marsh gentian was concerned, there's always sort of a general understanding that marsh gentian thrived on burning. So that this is sort of very rapid, quick, cool burns in the winter, which provide the right habitat, bare soil, relatively little competition that the gentian would thrive in. But for about the last 15 years or so, we've not done this. Partly out of choice, in particularly more recently, but going back sort of 10 years or so, the conditions just weren't there. You know, we weren't getting the sort of the really cold Januaries and Februaries that we were getting sort of back in the sort of 70s. But despite that lack of burning, we're still seeing this good increase in the population. So the site is still grazed, and there is a little bit of management going on as well. But the gentian seems to be thriving. So that's perhaps one positive change, and it's one of the species that could benefit in a positive way from the increased wetness that we're seeing sort of at various parts of the year, so that the peat is staying damper. Conversely, the hot, dry summers that we've experienced in recent years can also create problems for us. And looking at one very small species, and that's this nationally rare caddisfly up here, which occurs at Goch, and likes these sort of very shallow open pools that occur on the edge or actually out in the reed bed. And since the report in 2018 by Ian Wallace from the Natural History Museum in London, one of the things that he's been increasingly concerned about is the frequency with which these pools have been drying out in the summer, making it very difficult for the species to survive. What you can see here on the right hand side is the caddis case that this little fly makes, and interestingly enough, it can just about make it out here, the way that the bits of debris from plants sort of curve round the shell or of the case. So, and that is quite distinctive for this species. So although this is a tiny little species, it gives an indication of how the habitat can be subtly changing. And one thing that's also worth noting, that the worst year probably was 2018, and we even had problems remarkably in providing water for stock on the site who were out on the fen, which for a wetland is quite a bad thing, really. So yes, as I was saying, providing water for stock in such conditions becomes a real issue, and no matter where you are, whatever sort of site, providing water for stock is really important in a significant way, particularly on wetland sites like Goch, where grazing is a key part of the management of that site. But the wet seasons can also make it difficult for, as I said, for taking hay. The crop can be just too wet, flattened by the rain, and so we're unable to manage these sites in the way that we always have. And we have to think about what we're going to do about that and how we can manage it alternatively. Um, Obvious answer is taking earlier hay cuts, and that's likely to have a significant impact on the nature of the species within the sward. Um, so, or we can just revert to grazing through the autumn and winter months. Obviously, if you're thinking about climate change, one of the things that's easy to sort of consider is the coast, and Kemlyn on Anglesey is one of our most important sites, but also one of the most important wildlife sites in the whole of the UK, really, for the obvious reason for the a tern colony that occurs on the islands that you can see there in the lagoon. But what this slide does show really well as well is how fragile that habitat is. Um, and particularly in the face of storms. This one is one from back in the sort of the late 90s, where the ridge can take quite a hammering, and it can change its shape dramatically um, during that time. And it often does through the winter. The ridge will change its shape several times as a result of storms, not always this dramatic. But what we also get is sort of very high water um, on the in the lagoon. So you can see here the islands are more or less flooded, which usually happens through the winter. But also you get extreme high tides. Like this is the car park. For those of you who know Kemlyn, this is the car park at the west end of the ridge under about a foot and a half of water. And this is a spring tide sometime in late March. And you also can see some of the damage that occurs to some of the infrastructure as a result of the high tides and the strong currents associated with it. So one of the key concerns for us is the impact of some of these storms, and particularly the spring tides and our management of the lagoon through the weir. Um, Increasingly, what we've seen in recent years as we head into sort of April when the terns are starting to arrive, is that the weir has been topped by the last of the spring tides, the very big spring tides. And I think this year we had one that went up to 8 meters and completely overtopped the weir, even higher than the picture there. So it was coming over the concrete as well. The danger there is the tern colony being flooded, um, and yeah, that could be really significant, particularly later on in the season. But the other potential issue we have there is the impact on the lagoon itself, with increasing salinity and the increasing incursion of salt water, changing the lagoon from brackish to more of a saltwater habitat. So there's a little sort of collection of things in a sieve at the bottom there. Kemlyn is one of the most important saline lagoons in the whole of the UK, including sort of very tiny species like this little snail, but there's a whole range of other species associated with it. And what happens as the water conditions, the water quality changes from more saline or more where it's fluctuating to one where it's more saline, or even one where it's more freshwater, is you get species associated with those rather than the fluctuating conditions that you get associated with brackish water. The whole ridge itself is also an important feature. Is part of the special area of conservation under the European Habitats Directive. And it is naturally a very dynamic environment, and then that's what sort of allows sort of certain species like yellowhorn poppy to establish themselves, and species like sea kale, which likes that sort of very dynamic, changing environment and very harsh conditions. But what you can see here, and these two slides illustrate two different aspects. The bottom one, you can just almost see like there's a dry riverbed there, sort of where the seawater has overtopped the ridge and just rushed down into the lagoon. And when it does that, it rapidly drops the material it's carrying. So at the moment, the ridge has these little headlands that run along the sort of the central part of it as a result of the shingle being washed over and moved further inland. So the key concern here is about movement of shingle inwards and also the lowering of the ridge, and with the very obvious um, problems that could bring for the tern colony. But one other aspect to think about in relation to sort of climate change and increasing sort of damp, warm conditions is perhaps the likely increased prevalence of diseases. And there's a certain school of thought that thinks, the recent problems we've had with bird flu could be just another symptom of the changing climate. Uh, Thankfully, at Kemlin in 2024, we didn't have any problems. But as this slide shows here from the Animal and Public Health Authority, bird flu is still around. And over the last sort of couple of months, as perhaps might be expected in the autumn and winter with the movement of birds, there have been an increasing number of records in the sort of the wild bird population. So we are definitely sort of monitoring closely what's happening with that. But talking of diseases, another one that's sort of on the cards for us and has been increasingly playing a part in how we manage our woodlands is ash dieback. This slide here just illustrates some of the symptoms you can see with although this is actually oak, he says, looking at it now. I think it's ash trees towards the back there, which have been losing their leaves. The sorts of problems we can see on some of our reserves, like this particular picture is taken at Coed Cravenant, where trees sort of actually collapse when they get the disease to its full extent and become very vulnerable to damage from winds and storms, which are increasingly more of a problem. And so, and this leads us to have to reconsider how we're managing our sites, particularly when it comes to creating open spaces in our woodlands and thinning in our woodlands. But we always have to bear in mind how much damage and how much loss we're actually experiencing as a result of ash dieback, and adjust our management accordingly. So just thinking about our woodlands, perhaps just in terms of some of the species that we get there. So this is a shot of Coed Cravenant, one of our Celtic rainforests down near Harlock, and one of the key species we get there is the pied flycatcher, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. But you only have to look at some of the information that's available to show you sort of how poorly the sort of the UK population has been doing in recent years. You know, with sort of massive reductions in the population, small contraction in its distribution. And if you look at some of the information on the abundance, you can see how dramatically it's declined since the mid 90s, and the role sort of climate change might be playing in that, in its importance in relation to the abundance of prey, but for birds like the pied flycatcher, but not just the abundance, but the emergence of caterpillars as well, being delayed as a result of climate change, and how that might affect the feeding of young. And it's not just sort of the really characteristic birds of Celtic rainforests like the pied flycatcher, but it's things like great tits and wood warblers and chiffchaff, which can also be affected to a similar extent by these changing conditions, and in particular both the abundance of food and the appearance of food, but also just the poor weather through the summer. As far as sort of Celtic rainforests are concerned, particularly Coed Cravenant, you know, the other issue we have to think about is the sort of the incredible diversity of lower plants we get there. This slide sort of shows the location of a few species which Coed Cravenant is really important for. I won't try and pronounce those names, but they're quite rare lower plants. And so the changing condition, particularly the loss of species like ash and increasing openness of the canopy, can be really significant for such species and sort of result in them drying out. So we have to think about how these sites are regenerating and whether we need to sort of step in and do some underplanting. But one of the other things that we've noticed, and then one of the issues we've had in recent years, is goats. So that the very mild winters we've had in recent years in particular have meant that the feral goat population is doing really well. So that means there's a large population of browsing animals, both in Coed Cravenant, but also across Northwest Wales and Eryri as a whole, really. And although some browsing is perhaps a good thing, and we're seeing that at Coed Cravenant, it's the excessive browsing that has always been a problem in the past, is something that we need to try and manage. But our woodlands aren't always up on the mountains or on the side of a valley. Namporth, not too far from Bangor, is right down on the coast. It's a partly ancient woodland, partly secondary woodland on old quarry sites. Um, and one of the key species there is the Menai whitebeam. Um, See, there's a picture sort of down there in the bottom left, and that really likes these sort of edge habitats, sort of quite sort of vulnerable habitats. If I go back to the original picture, you can see that there's a wide beach there, and the Menai whitebeam tends to occur in these zones right above the shore. And one of the problems we've noticed is that with increasing sort of storms and the high tides, there's a significant erosion occurring, and we're in danger of losing some of these species. And this is an endemic species, and Nat Porth is one of only a very small handful of sites where it occurs. There is also some concern in relation to the increase in the use of the straits by particularly powered water boats, creating wakes, strong wakes across the straits that can exacerbate the erosion that's occurring at Nat Porth. One of our other coastal sites, and again not too far away, is the Spinners. I'm sure again everyone's familiar with that. Really popular site for bird watching, and in particular for the kingfisher, but also the species like the water rail and a whole range of other species that are seen there. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the story of the culvert, which gets regularly blocked at the moment by high tides. Particularly at the moment, it seems like it doesn't need much in the way of a high tide or even a strong wind, and it can get blocked. It's partly related to the fact the way the shape of the beach has changed, and this slide here which shows you some work being carried out to clear the culvert. I think this is actually when we were doing some repairs to the structure of the culvert head wall here, but you can see that the slope of the beach has changed dramatically as well. So we're getting increasingly regular problems, as I'm sure lots of people will know, and it's almost on a monthly basis, if not more sometimes during the winter. And at the moment, we try and deal with that as quickly as we can. We are looking into solutions, but one of the things we are considering is what's happening on that particular stretch of coast in the future, and the various predictions that are occurring. So this, I've got a few slides which illustrates the expected flood levels and the problems that we're having to consider at this point. So this sort of says what will happen by 2100. It's the annual flood levels. So you can see the red indicates areas that will be flooded. And this is both a result of sea level rise and coastal flooding as a result of that sea level rise. Again, this illustrates it slightly more in a little bit more detail. So this is the risk from rivers, and you can see here's the Ogwen. Can you see my cursor moving as I do that? Susan,
No.
can you see my cursor moving? No, can you see it now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Right. Cheers. Okay. So you can see that here's the Ogwen here, and you can see that flooding from the Ogwen is likely to come from sort of the south of the nature reserve. Here's the Spinneys here, but also potentially down this way as well. So significant issues sort of from river flooding. And if I just move on to the next slide, you can see this is the risk from sea flooding. And you can see it's a much larger extent, but the two issues combined do give us a significant problem to deal with. And clearing the culvert seems like a very small thing that we're trying to do to alleviate this much bigger problem. And I think mostly so far I've talked about sort of wildlife. But obviously here there's a significant issue for people as well, not only in terms of people who might want to come to the nature reserve, but also our neighbours on the farm here and in the houses here who are also at risk from the flooding. So all of the problems I've mentioned so far, there are significant issues for people as well. So yeah, so just to come back to this slide and to look at some of the problems, and the state we're in. As I said right at the beginning, wildlife is in a very sorry state, and climate change is only going to add to that and make a whole host of further problems and exacerbate some of the existing problems. So what are we doing about it? So as far as the Wildlife Trust is concerned, we have our strategy for 2030 called Bringing Nature Back, which is um, so within that there are three goals: nature in recovery, meaningful action, and nature-based solutions. So as far as reserves are concerned, they sort of fit into each of those goals really. And if I sort of just look at one in particular, nature and recovery by 2030 and what that means, this is the challenge that we've set ourselves by 2030, not just ourselves, but everyone working towards nature and recovery in North Wales. So 30% of the land and seas in North Wales is actively managed. The abundance and diversity of wildlife is increasing significantly, and natural processes and ecological systems will be more intact, more connected, and functioning significantly better. So that very last one comes back to sort of bigger, better, and more connected. So that's it, and that's quite a challenge. That is quite a challenge. Undeniably, that's quite a challenge. And in terms of our nature reserves, they fit into it sort of fits across all three of those, what we need to do and what have to do. But one small target is illustrated by this lovely pie chart. I do like a pie chart. So one target that we set ourselves was that by 2030 we would have 1,000 hectares of nature reserves, and we're not far off. We've got 5% to go, which is somewhere in the region of about 50 or 60 hectares to go. So we're nearly there. On that one particular very small target, which is always nice to hit your targets. But there's significantly more to do than that. So alongside our strategy, another sort of important document for us, sort of guiding what we're doing, is the RSWT, the Royal Society for Wildlife Trust Embracing Nature report, which looks at climate change adaptation at the Wildlife Trust. And this is what we're aiming for. So if you can compare this slide to the one which shows you all the problems, this shows a natural world in much better condition, where there's natural regeneration of woodland, upland, peatland being restored, the marine environment is much better protected, more hedgerows and more wildlife generally. So what sort of thing are we having to do to look at that? Well, one of the key things we need to do, whether we're looking at our nature reserves or in the wider countryside, is to think about ecosystem resilience. And that basically means how an ecosystem can deal with the problems that it's facing. And that means that what we're thinking about is how we can manage the habitats, our nature reserves and the wider countryside, to make sure that they can resist, recover and adapt to the changes that they are facing. So it might involve a sort of a change to the way we work, of thinking bigger and better, more connected habitats. So what we're thinking about is the ecosystem services. And if you'd like to know more about ecosystem services, there's a QR code, which if you watch the video, which after the recording, you'll be able to sort of click on that, and that takes you to some information from Natural Resources Wales about ecosystem services. Okay, so in terms of us improving ecosystem resilience, we can look at the diversity of a habitat or an ecosystem, its extent, its condition, and its connectivity. So there's the four key different aspects of an ecosystem. So what I'm going to focus on for the next part of the talk is to look at extent and connectivity, really, just so I don't end up talking for the rest of the evening. So one obvious example we can talk about is a species, where we can think about the extent of that species, its distribution across its range, and how well those populations are doing. So ourselves at Kemlin, we've sort of looked at how we can provide further habitat for a species by using rafts, and there are examples from around the UK where rafts have been used to varying degrees of success. But what we were trying to do at Kemlin with our little rafts was to see if we could move the tern colony, basically, or move a few terns. It was successful in a small way. They were used by roosting birds and by one nesting common tern. At Kemlin, we also have to consider the lagoon as well. So there was some work done looking at the abundance of the lagoonal invertebrates around where we're putting the raft. So it's interesting when you start thinking about ecosystems, you often think you will be thinking about more than just one species, and trying to balance the needs and the requirements of those different species. So in terms of improving the extent of the distribution of terns in general, not just sandwich terns, there's a number of colonies around Anglesey, of which there are three main ones, but there's a lots of historic sites where they've occurred, and I think we can be looking at how those sites can be brought back into use by terns, and whether that's even possible. So as far as terns are concerned, is that really important issue of trying to find bits of the coast what they could use. And I think it always strikes me that one of the things we have to consider is our use of the coast alongside the way seabirds, and particularly ground nesting seabirds, use coastal habitats as well, and what we would be prepared to do to allow seabirds to nest in such sort of fragile coastal habitats. Come back to the spinneys. I think the top aerial photographs gives you an idea of where the spinney sits in the sort of the Arvon coastal plain. And as indicated before, we're well aware of the sort of the flooding around the spinneys. But this slide sort of gives an indication of the issue slightly further afield. But what it does highlight is that the spinneys is just part of a much bigger area where coastal inundation is going to be a significant problem in the future. So to arrive at some sort of solution for the whole area, then we have to be thinking about working with a whole range of partners, and also considering a whole range of legislation that would affect whatever solution we come to. And it won't be cheap. So looking at sort of engineering cost benefit analysis for things like new culverts and extending culverts. The cost of extending the culvert at the spinneys could run easily to £100,000. So we're not looking at cheap solutions to these problems. But there are opportunities for creating new habitats around the coast, but this will only come with the agreement and involvement of all the stakeholders on the coast. Just to think about a different aspect of ecosystem resilience, and that's connectivity. And a really obvious one to think about is woodlands. So at the moment in Wales, there's as it says there, about 400,000 hectares of woodland, a bit less than 20% of the land area, and not even a quarter of it is ancient woodland. Then as far as we're concerned, we've got 9 nature reserves that you could call woods as a whole across North Wales, and about 10 other sites have significant areas of woodland on them, places like Gwaith Powder, for example. Interesting enough, the percentage figure of our total land holding is rather similar to the one for the whole of Wales, sort of about 19.4% of Wales and 17% of our land holding. A funny coincidence. So just to think about improving connectivity, just taking one of our woodlands over in the east, Vol Uchaf, which is a relatively small woodland not far from Mold. So I'm just reminding myself of how big it is. Yeah, it's not even 4 hectares, so quite a small woodland with a variety of sort of open areas in it. But one thing that we are considering here is how it sort of sits in the wider landscape. So what this slide illustrates is the stars are our reserves. So Vol is the one here. And there's our other woodland reserves. These are definitely woodland reserves, these 3 here. And all the red sort of diamonds are areas or sites where we've worked with landowners and farmers to restore or enhance the woodland habitat in some way, whether it's directly in woodlands or perhaps through hedgerow management or even creation. So that's sort of the work of one of our living landscape projects, and people are Johnny Holson and Sarah Ellis working with our neighbours. And one particular species that could benefit from such work is the lovely little dormouse, which requires good woodland habitat with a complex understory and certain species present, but also the ability to move through the countryside and the connectivity that you can establish between different blocks of woodland. But we also need to think about creating new areas of woodland, and I would hopefully most of you will have heard of Brynniavan, and our plans to create woodland on the site, and we are still exploring those plans, developing those plans with Welsh governments and NRW, sort of creating woodland up on the slopes of Bulkmire up here, but also looking at creating much better hedgerows. As you can see from this photo, the hedgerows on the lower part of the site, which is the foreground here, are almost non-existent. So we're looking at creating significantly wide hedgerows and almost not hedgerows, more linear scrub, but blocks of woodland as well to connect with existing areas of woodland, which are both just outside of the bottom of the photograph, but also further over to the what is actually the west, but the right on this picture. But one of the things we're having to think about in terms of creating those woodland habitats is the supply of trees, and we have a very active nursery in the east with a great deal of help from volunteers organised by Sarah Ellis, and now we're looking at supplementing that with smaller nurseries elsewhere, associated with some of our nature reserves across North Wales. So not only to provide some of the obvious species that we might want, sort of oak and hazel, but also thinking about some of the more special species like the Menai whitebeam that I mentioned early on, but also thinking about how we might replace ash in woodlands and what species we could use to do that. Looking at species like aspen in that sort of particular situation, but providing a range of species to help us with our tree planting plans, but not just us, other people as well. But one other thing in terms of creating habitats, and one woodland habitat that we would perhaps like to replace as much as we can, particularly where it occurs on deep peat, is conifer plantation. And we do have a couple of sites where we've done that. Most successfully is at Causa Sinai over near Bala. The aerial photograph on the left-hand side shows the extent of a former conifer plantation, which was for the most part on peat and in places on very deep peat. So that was about 11 hectares or so. About 15 years ago, we felled it. And since that time, we've been working on managing it and trying to improve the wetland conditions using funding from both RSWT through its Precious Peatland program, but also from Europe through the Care Peat project. So we had a significant restoration plan, and this just gives a brief summary of it. With this, sort of shows you in the middle of the site these key areas of peatland of deep peat here, and we were able to carry out a program of creating bunds which were holding water on site and have allowed the site to naturally flood, and hopefully over time we'll create the sort of wetland conditions that we want, while at the same time creating this nice mosaic and transition to other habitats around it. Recently, actually, in terms of extensions to Causa Sinai, we also have a new extension to the site, which is this area of marshy grassland and mire to the north, which is about sort of I think it's about 8 or 9 hectares, and we've only sort of completed on that in the last month or so. So that's an exciting new bit of the reserve, which again includes areas of sort of deep peat, particularly sort of in this area, but again expanding the habitats and making the site bigger and hopefully connecting it to other areas of sort of a wetland habitat further to the north. This just gives you an idea of some of the work that was carried out. This is a pond that was created, and the people who are admiring the pond are all standing on a bund that was created, and the bund carries on across that way, so holding water on the site and flooding the habitat. Obviously, one of the things with peatlands is their sort of contribution to the sort of carbon um, in the environment and carbon sequestration. So we have been working with Metropolitan University of Manchester, or Manchester Metropolitan University, I think is get the words in the right order, who are looking at carbon fluxes on the wetland as it's been restored and how they change over time. Thinking about wetlands and what we can do on a sort of larger scale, um, our one of our new landscape scale projects is Corsus Calamorn, which is working on the Anglesey fens. Um, Looking at these key sites, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 key sites, and they're all part of the uh, Anglesey Fens SAC, and but not just working on those sites, working around those sites to try and improve the connectivity between them, but also improve the water quality. So we have a small team of people who hopefully you'll be seeing and hearing more of, and maybe it's something for a talk in the future, a bit more about what they're doing. So you got Neil Dunsire, who is the project manager at the back, Oshan and Megan, who supporting Neil, and hopefully over the next sort of year or so, you'll be hearing a lot about them and what the work they're doing and help improve and restore the Anglesey Fens. Um, right, so that's quite a quick run through for some of our nature reserves. But just before I sort of the next bit, what I wanted to talk about was just maybe just change the title slightly of my talk and maybe just think about nature reserves and the future for nature reserves really, in the face of some of the challenges that we have. And I've sort of at the end there, when I was particularly talking about the Anglesey Fens project, we're looking away from our nature reserve and looking at the areas around them and how they can be managed to support wildlife and how all that fits together as part of a big jigsaw. So I think the important thing to think about is the different approaches that we can use. To go back to Bryn Ifan, and as Susan said right at the beginning, is Bryn Ifan a nature reserve or what is it? Is it half a nature reserve or what? And then that's a very interesting question, really. So Bryn Ifan is a big site. It's about 184 hectares, give or take. Um, as I've said, we're looking at sort of creating Celtic rainforest through part of the Aviva Celtic Rainforest project. And you might have seen on the news today or on your news feeds what a dire condition the Celtic rainforest is in Wales. The newly formed Alliance for Welsh Rainforest, was that what it was called? I think that was what it was called, saying how poor the poor condition of a lot of our Celtic rainforests. But that is just one aspect of what we're trying to do at Bryn Ifan. So that's most significantly up here. And although it's slightly out of this picture, but you can see another example here. We've got an area of wetland as well, which support populations of marsh artillery. And that is perhaps the sort of like traditional nature reserve that you might expect. It's about 20 hectares, which is about the average size of one of our nature reserves. So it sort of sits quite nicely as a nature reserve. But the other bit is this bit down here. And here we are working on plans where we're trying to bring together wildlife conservation and agriculture, and what can be achieved, and how we might do that, and the various elements that we can bring into that, whether that's increasing tree planting, whether it's working with hembant and looking at sort of permaculture or agroecology. Those plans are being developed. So it's not necessarily a nature reserve, but it's land that's owned by a wildlife trust. So it's a bit different for us. Having said that, there are other really good examples elsewhere in the UK of where people are thinking really big when it comes to trying to restore wildlife. So you've got examples like the Great Fen in Huntingdonshire, which is they're looking at trying to transform over 3,000 hectares of land. And so, and they're buying land to enable them to do this. So in effect, it is a nature reserve. It's a very, very big nature reserve by UK standards, but they're having to buy the land, and that seems to be the most efficient and effective way forward in terms of trying to restore wildlife habitats. It's well worth having a look at their website. Just search Great Fen. Fantastic amount of work going on right across the board, whether it's for wildlife and a whole fantastic range of wildlife, but also for people and access as well. It's amazing. Um, but you might also have seen in the news recently the Rothbury estate, which um, the Northumberland Wildlife Trust is trying to buy. A huge area of land, 3,800 hectares. Um, and why perhaps this is a bit like Brynivon in that it probably won't be considered your traditional nature reserve, but it's owned by a wildlife trust, and that gives Northumberland Wildlife Trust the control over how that land's managed. So it's not a nature reserve, it's a bit more than a nature reserve, but it's just amazing to think of what you can do and if you think big. And I think one of the things we should bear in mind with our nature reserve is what is happening outside of them in the wider world. And one of the big things that's happening in Welsh agriculture is the sustainable farming scheme. Um, and this is obviously going to be really important in terms of what the Welsh landscape might look like in the future. And the wildlife trusts in Wales have been working really hard, sort of with Welsh government and their advisors to try and develop a scheme that delivers for us. So it's quite disappointing to hear recently that they've removed the requirement for 10% of land for tree planting or woodland. And the scheme does seem to be being watered down from what we'd hoped it might be. But equally, one of the concerns for us at the Wildlife Trust is it seems that NRW will be looking to the Sustainable Farming Scheme to deliver the management of triple SIs as well. So that's going to be quite important for us. And we'll be sort of waiting with bated breath really as that scheme develops. It's due to be rolled out in 2026, which was already a year later than initially planned. So finally, I just sort of make a plug really, but highlight one of the issues that faces in such a significant time for wildlife and for biodiversity is increasing need to be recording what's happening and understanding what's happening and collecting data on wildlife and how it's changing. So we've got making an increasing effort to get people involved in this aspect of our work. Yeah, so there's a little hashtag there, the hashtag nature counts. That's the title of our project, where we're looking at just trying to provide more opportunities for people to get involved, whether it's birds or whether it's sort of botany. It's just trying to improve our understanding of what's happening, what we've got, and what we're in danger of losing, really. And there's another QR code there if you want to find more about how to combat climate change in terms of what you're doing, how you can help. There's a little QR code there. And that's my last little picture of a jolly jumping squirrel and a few plugs for how you can help the Wildlife Trust becoming part of our growing team of people supporting nature's recovery. Cool. So that was that. Hopefully there's some questions and we can have a bit of a discussion. I'll leave the picture of the jumping squirrel up because it's lovely.
Minute. Oh, hello.
Hi,
Back
so
on. Hi. Well, thank you. Fantastic. I mean, you covered a huge area. I don't know what to say really, because there's so many aspects that you've covered, and we live in a huge area, don't we? As a trust, we must cover as big an area as some other trusts, and different environments, different ecologies that are covered. And you've given us a great overview of where we're up to, and then from what's going to happen in some of the reserves and some of your future plans. And so that's great. So I don't know if anybody's got any questions. Are there any questions there, Gary, or anyone wants to chip in?
Not as yet, but Sam says really interesting. Thank you. Oh, here we go. I have a question from Sam. Do you think people planting trees and plants in their own garden can help?
Yes, I do. And obviously you have to be very selective about what you're planted. So native trees is always good, and native plants. And then if you're looking at plants, and I'm sort of assuming you mean sort of wildflowers. Even in a small garden, you can provide plants that can benefit, particularly insects and pollinators. So even a small patch can help. And I think when you do things like that, it's important to think about what's happening around you and how it all builds up um, into a much bigger picture. The little pieces of a jigsaw that are sort of combining together to provide habitat and food for a whole range of species. So and it's not just about what you plant either. It's about what you do in your garden. It's about the chemicals that you choose to use or not use. It's about whether you have a little hedgehog hole under your fence so that hedgehogs can come and go, and all sorts of things like that. It's about what you wash your dog in, whether you treat it for fleas or not. So there's a whole range of things that you can do at an individual level. But yeah, planting some good species that are good for pollinators or for butterflies is a really good thing to do, and to have that sort of connected landscape. I can't see the whole. Hold on, let me just get the chat up so I can see the whole of the question.
Yes.
So we've also got Polly who's asking, thank you, any beavers involved in your plans? They're very trendy.
So just to finish off, yes, we could give you some advice. So if you just drop us an email, we can send you some information about what to plant in your area. That's no problem. And that was for Sam. Beavers, yeah. So there are beavers in Wales, and but they're sort of who knows how they got there. So my colleague Adrian, what he's working on at the moment is getting the license to allow us to legally introduce beaver into Wales. And it would be great. They're ecosystem engineers, so that sort of scale of work that I was talking about in relation to the spinneys and the Arvan coastal plain. You get some beavers into a wetland and they'll do that for you. They'll create the ponds and the pools that will bring in amphibians and kingfishers and herons to feed in them, and who knows, maybe even a booming bittern. But yeah, so they're fantastic. So hopefully they will be part of the plans in the future. Yes, definitely. Yeah.
Hi, Chris. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Kate.
Yes. Hi. And obviously fascinating and lots going on. I'm particularly interested in the new Anglesey Fens project because you know about there are individual private owners who have meadows and small bits of land which they're trying to manage for biodiversity. And I'm sure there are some within that envelope
of
the fens. And it would be good with the connectivity to try and make sure that they're mapped and they're known to the project. So that's something.
And what I'd suggest is if someone talks to Neil, or Neil comes and talks to the group. I'm sure that he'd be keen on either Neil or Oshan could maybe do one of the regular visits. They could come along to a visit and just talk to people. I think that'd be great. That's just the sort of thing they want to do, is to get connectivity.
I was tremendously impressed by the number of sites in the Clwyd Hills which contact has been made with landowners to advise or improve hedgerows and so on. I mean, it was enormous scattering of sites. It was really good. Anyway, thank you.
And I see that Anna, who I can see on my screen, has just chipped in with her contact details for Sam. Thanks, Anna. What I found interesting was just this morning, just sort of sitting and reading the paper and looking at things it was how many relevant pieces of news there were to what we're going to talk about tonight. About Celtic rainforest and about the loss of tree planting from the sustainable farming scheme. So it's just that there's just so much going on all the time, and that has an impact. It's amazing.
Fascinating about what can happen at the spinneys. I mean, managed retreat, roll back. I mean, some of those where the coastal footpath is, I mean, it's eroding badly in places already.
Oh,
just to the
Madryn, yeah, I've heard that Madryn has been particularly bad, and there's been huge chunks eroded
yeah
away. Yeah,
yeah
so yeah, yeah. I mean,
yeah
I think there's been various work done over, more than a decade ago now that's looked at the potential there, and things have only got more difficult and more challenging
mm,
along that
mm,
stretch of the coast. So, I think do feel it's time to revisit it and to look at what the opportunities really are,
yeah
what can be done in it, which, it might involve the sort of the coastline changing and the wildlife on it changing, but,
mm,
it's just allowing those processes to happen because they're going to happen anyway, whether we like it or
yeah
not.
yeah.
Yeah.
And you can't, I mean, it's not the sort of place where you can spend millions of pounds because the land can't be worth that. I mean, it has to be allowed to become salt marsh or whatever it becomes,
Yeah,
some of it.
yeah,
Mm,
indeed.
good.
Anyone else? Hello? Anyone else want to? Well, thank you very much, Chris.
Well,
That was
pleasure.
brilliant, giving us all a lot to think about, and also, I've learned a lot about what you've actually doing with all these reserves, and a bit more about the reserves themselves, because especially if it's things that are outside our area, and it's really good to hear about what's going on. So thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thanks, Susan.